Welcome back to the Dr. Greg Jones Optimization Academy podcast. Today's conversation is going deeper than surface level health data and using science to make truly personalized decisions. My guest today is Dr. Sharon Hausman-Cohen, a Harvard Medical School trained physician whose career has taken a rare but fascinating path from family medicine into the world of clinical genomics. She is a nationally recognized leader in precision medicine and one of the driving forces behind IntelliXX DNA, a powerful clinical decision support platform used by healthcare professionals to translate genomic data into real actionable care. In an age where millions of people have taken at-home DNA tests and then done nothing with the results, Dr. Hausman-Cohen and IntelliXX DNA are focused on what really matters. They help clinicians and patients move beyond raw genetic data to understand how genes interact with inflammation, metabolism, cardiovascular risk, and cognition, and longevity too, across a lifetime. This is not about prediction for the sake of fear. It's about insight, strategy, and prevention. So in today's episode, we're going to do a few really cool things. We're going to unpack the difference between genetics and genomics and why that distinction changes everything. We'll explore hidden drivers of heart disease that don't show up on standard labs and how genomic insights can guide nutrition, supplementation, and lifestyle choices with precision. So if you've ever wondered how to use your biology as a roadmap instead of a limitation, this conversation will open your eyes to what's possible when medicine truly becomes personalized. Let's get into it. All right. Good morning. So first I got to ask you, what do you like to go by? Are we going by Sharon?
Sharon is fine. Dr. HC, whatever you want to call me.
All right. So, yeah, just for the sake of time, you got one of those long last names, as I was doing during the intro. You got blessed with the homozygous last name. You have heterozygous last name because you have one of each, and we'll get into all that. But first, I want to say thank you for making time for being on the show.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's been a long time coming. I remember when I first found out about you guys, I was like, oh my God, there's no way in the world I'm ever going to be able to do this. It's like, we take our basic epigenetics and, a little bit of genomics in school, but very minor, major variants for things, especially when it comes to, like celiac, things like that. But when it comes to actually reading a report, this is all relatively new. And so being that it's relatively new across the board, your journey is taking you from Harvard Med School to family medicine, and now you're in genomics, and this is a relatively new field. How did you get here?
Well, I got here out of necessity, but even before I was at Harvard Medical School, I was at Harvard as a PhD student. So I was always a researcher at heart. But I stopped after my master's because I wanted to do something more than just one topic, and became a family physician because that's people birth to death. So that's pretty broad. Like you as a naturopath, we like to help lots of people with lots of different kinds of things going on. And but the researcher in me was always there. And part of my research background was in genetics, cell biology, all these things of how things work is what I call that. And what happened was after the 23andMe revolution, where people would start to come to me and they would bring me their 23andMe data and say, can you use this to help me prevent heart disease, to help me prevent Alzheimer's, and on and on and on, whatever was in their family. And so I, at the time, had recently just formed a new practice that was a personalized medicine practice with my co-founder, Carol, and we had looked at all the different genomics companies out there to be able to try to address personalized medicine and answer these patients' questions. And what we found is the field really wasn't there yet. There were personalized, there was precision medicine using genomics for choosing drugs, pharmacogenomics. There was some regarding some nutrients, some nutrigenomics, but nobody had taken on the topic of, can we kind of dissect what are the modifiable root causes of cognitive decline and depression and anxiety and heart disease and diabetes and on and on and on. And so we basically took this on initially one step at a time for specific patients with specific diseases they were interested in. We realized it took lots and lots and lots of time for each disease state, and then even more time to figure out what to do about it for each of the genes. And that's more than half the battle, because knowing that you have a bunch of gene variants that contribute to a particular disease, but not knowing what to do about them is not useful. And so then we realized we couldn't do it one-on-one for each patient. It would make it prohibitively cost prohibitive. And so IntelliXX DNA was formed, and we are a research and education company that allows clinicians to practice personalized medicine. So we share all the research that we do as our team and make it useful.
Right. So, how long have you guys been doing this as IntelliXX DNA?
So IntelliXX DNA was founded in 2016, and our first conference, our first basic reports came out in 2017. But we were a real small group then, and now we're a much larger one.
Okay. That's awesome. And congratulations. Almost heading to 10, getting close to 10 years. That's really
Yeah.
incredible. So, you mentioned this earlier because a lot of people have done the 23andMe test because it blew up, back
Yeah.
then. It was like, oh, look at your genetics and all this stuff. And it's evolved, and I did it, and I was like, okay, it was kind of a fun little, oh, I have, I'm from this country and all that, a little bit of high level risk. But the thing is, I looked at that thing, I feel like 15 years ago, and put it somewhere, and I don't even know where it is now. And a
Uh,
lot of people do that, right? And when I've listened to your talks and some of the things online, you've argued successfully that medical genomics is different than that test, but it's also different than genetics. So what's the difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's start backwards. Let's start with genetics. So genetics was around well before they sequenced the human genome, and it was the study of diseases and traits that were able to be inherited. So everything from whether someone has curly hair or straight hair, brown eyes or blue eyes, and then from a disease standpoint, genetic diseases, again, these inherited diseases are things like cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease and Tay-Sachs. And so that if mom and dad were both carriers, then the child had a good chance of being affected. But that doesn't really apply to most diseases that we as doctors take care of. Because if you look at anything that's a chronic disease, everything from autism to diabetes to heart disease to, again, cognitive decline, depression, anxiety, there's not one gene that causes those. So they're not genetic in that classic inheritable sense. They may have some traits that are inherited, but when we now have the human genome and we look at them, what we realize is that they're actually due to lots of different pieces of a puzzle coming together. So imagine, let's take heart disease because people know a fair amount about heart disease. We know that high cholesterol is important, but there's also specific types of inflammation. There's also things that relate to little clotting that can happen in the arteries. There's also things that relate to the stiffness of the arteries and if calcium builds up and on and on and on. And so if you make a list of the major things that contribute to heart disease, they all have their own different genomics. And then if you know which particular genomics affects an individual, then and you know what the gene variant does, what the gene does that's kind of causing the problem gene, then you can address it with much more specificity. And we have demonstrated that again published in the literature, with children with autism, people with cognitive decline, people with treatment-resistant mental health, that we can often help uncover some of those hidden root causes and help them get well. So that's how we're different. Now, the ancestry, 23andMe was developed for ancestry and kind of for fun to help the modern household get more out of their own DNA, but it was never designed as a health product. They did give a few gene variants, but for something, for example, like macular degeneration, they'll give like one gene variant, but that doesn't mean there's not others. For diabetes, they'll give again one gene variant, but the gene variant that they give is in 40% of the population, and there's so many others. And so it's not enough information to help someone get well or even to help someone practice preventive medicine, because that's not what it was geared at.
Okay. Now that's a good one there because something that's happened over the last few years is you can type in genomics And I won't say there's a ton, but there are quite a few at-home genetic tests that can claim it's like, take control of your health, look at your risk factors for heart disease and Alzheimer's, and the person can just go pay their $300, spit in the tube, wait 3 or 4 weeks, and you get this report. So what separates that from what you guys are doing?
That's a great question as well. So when you do a direct-to-consumer report, they're going to give you a little bit of information and broad generalized recommendations because that's what they're allowed to do. They can't give you medical advice. And so you might find out, for example, that you have ApoE4. And ApoE4 in the literature is associated with anywhere from 3 to 14 times the risk of cognitive decline of Alzheimer's. However, that's not enough information because there are people who have ApoE4 that have less than half that risk. And then there are people that have ApoE4 who have a lot more risk depending on other genes that interact. So that's one difference is they give one little snapshot and the reality is that it's not enough. And I always joke that I want to bring one of my patients who's an ApoE44. So that's like considered really bad in the news. There was in fact the NIH was thinking of classifying that as a gene that means you're going to get Alzheimer's as pathogenic if you get 2 copies. But she's 81 years old and is the 92nd percentile for cognition for her age. And so we know that's not true. And why is that not true? Because number one, she did not inherit some of the things that can cause problems with it. There's a gene called BCHE, the K variant, that's notorious for interacting with ApoE4 and having a lot of the risk. So when you don't have it, that cuts your risk in half. She doesn't have some of the other things that affect the mitochondria, or she only has 1 copy. And also diet and lifestyle interact with genomics. So that's a big difference as well for her. And then she has, again, some good things. Well, in IntelliXX DNA, we're going to give you a much more full picture. When you order a cognition report, you're not going to get 3 gene variants. You're going to get 300. And now your doctor doesn't have to go over all 300 with you, and they're not. Actually, the memory and cognition report has 450, but you're going to get hundreds. And the ones that will be highlighted are the 10 or 20 most important for you. And because everything's important, hormones are important, your how you transport nutrients to the brain. Again, I said mitochondria, but even in mitochondria, there's different parts of them that can be affected. Whether or not you can make CoQ10, whether or not you have problems with processing amyloid. And I won't go on and on because it's just a list, but that's all really important. And then there's another step that makes IntelliXX DNA different. So IntelliXX DNA is not a direct-to-consumer test. It is what's called a clinical decision support tool, which just is a fancy term under the FDA as we can only sell to clinicians because we're giving essentially medical grade information. So in our report, when you have a particular gene variant, you'll be able to not just have that broad generalization like TCF7L2 is the one that for diabetes that 23andMe gave. And it's like, oh, eat a lower sugar diet. Okay, well, we all could do that without our genomics if we had diabetes. But
Mhm.
very specific of what does that gene do and how to affect it. And you can have 10 different gene variants that contribute to diabetes, and they all have different interventions. Just like when we were talking about with heart disease, some of those things you would give vitamin K2 for. Some of those things you would give aspirin for. So IntelliXX DNA gives diet, of course, and lifestyle, of course, but also targeted supplements and targeted medicines based on the literature. And then everything is referenced and evidence-based because we are not trying to make any medical decisions. We are giving doctors and licensed healthcare providers everything they need to make the best possible personalized medicine decisions. So it's a completely different category of tools and much, much more in depth in what kind of knowledge you get back.
Yeah. I can kind of liken it to it's one of those websites, man, and it's escaped me right now where you can God, man, it's a medical textbook, but they have a website and you can type in, say, hypertension, and it has a kind of patient page and they have a professional page. The patient page is very much like big picture. The professional page going to the studies. It's got some more diagnostic
Like up to
information.
date. You're thinking of up to
Right.
date.
Up to date. Up to date.
Yeah,
And
up to
yeah, up
date
to
came out of Harvard, Dr. Rose, who was my
right.
professor. So we definitely took that model in mind.
Right. And you
in
can't
the-
get the clinician side without a license, right? So it's
Yes.
I look at it like that. Yeah.
So Dr. Rose, up to date, that is a perfect example of a clinical decision support tool. So their patient version gives some information, but legally can't give all that detailed information because then patients might mistakenly think that they can prescribe for themselves. And there's a lot that goes into medical decision making. And some things can affect your stroke risk, your clotting risk. And it's important to understand the whole picture. So that's why there are rules as to what information can be given. But exactly, up to date's another example of a clinical decision support tool.
Exactly. Exactly. So you brought up a topic that I really want to dive into with heart disease, because as a clinician, that can be challenging, right? Because you'll have 10 patients you may see in a day, right? And one person may say, hey, mom, dad, granddad all had high blood pressure, high cholesterol. You look at their lab work and it's like, well, you're okay. Don't see it in you, but yes, I mean, you have the risk factors, just not without a genomics test, just knowing you have family history. And then you'll have Swan. It's like, well, dad only is the only person I know, and their cholesterol is almost uncontrollable. They got high lipoprotein A, and you're just like, you've got A, B, C, and D going on, CRP. You're just like, wait a minute. But then you get into some more of the studies, and it's like, well, there are people who you look at, I think it's up to 50%, 40% of patients who have normal cholesterol have cardiovascular disease, right? And so this is what really got me into this, because now when I started doing the reports, and you mentioned earlier with the brain thing, like there's like 400 genes, and that's what intimidates. I'm like, oh my God, this is one section, 400 genes. I'm never going to get this, right? And so with
But
the
you've
heart
gotten it,
disease,
haven't you?
it practice and repetition. That's what got me really fascinated in the work you guys do, because now we're able to see some of the risk and things like that. But this is the analogy I'm using. I'm glad you're here because I want to see if this can help me clarify that. And when I think about, say it's heart disease, we're going to dive into that, and you have all these risk factors. The way I look at it is if I pulled out my phone and said, hey, I want to drive to the Grand Canyon, and it's going to plot a route, all right? Not considering traffic, construction. It said, here's your route. This is how long it takes. If you drive this route, this is where you're going to get. This is where you're going to go in this amount of time. And I kind of look at that as like the kind of report you have, these variants, all that. This is your direction. But also with epigenetics, the way you live, that's like, wait a minute, there's construction here. I'm going to go and alter a route. There's a faster route here. Maybe we avoid this. So that's how I'm kind of looking at it with genetics. Or is there a different way to picture that?
I haven't looked at it in that way, but I think it's an interesting analogy. Um, I I think of it again. I tend to use more the analogy of like, well, what if there are 20 different really strong things or 12 things that can contribute to heart disease and they're all in this bag, and you've got 5 pieces, but you don't know which 5 pieces you have that make up your puzzle, or 4 pieces making the square. Well, then you have to address everything. And that's much more difficult because it's not just your heart you want to protect. You want to protect your heart and your brain and your bones and your metabolic system. And so if you did everything known to help with heart disease, that's just too much. But if now you know that you're somebody who puts too much calcium in your arteries, then you can go, okay, I absolutely need vitamin K2. If you know that you're somebody who has that microclotting, that's what Lp(a) does. It causes the microclotting. Then when you get older, there's good evidence that you might benefit from aspirin, or if you want something natural, there are other natural things that can help with that kind of microclotting, like pycnogenol, or nattokinase. But then there are things that are common, like the cholesterol and the calcification. But what if instead in your family, the heart disease is something much less common? So I had a patient who had a heart attack at 60, and that's young, given that I'm over 60, 60 is young. And so you go, wow, why did this guy have a heart attack at 60? And he, unfortunately, he luckily survived, but he came to me after he had his heart attack, and his genomics were really clear. He had a gene that caused more than 3 times the risk of heart disease, but the gene was not a common one. It's only a few percent of people in the population. And it has to do with his ability to make glutathione. And for listeners who don't know what glutathione is, it removes all the junk from your body. It's the master detox antioxidant, pathway. And so I think of it kind of like a paper towel picking everything up. Well, this guy had a hobby working with that involved working with metals, working on cars, working with a lot of different chemicals and solvents. That's not a great hobby for someone with problems with glutathione. He also could not make CoQ10. Well, again, that's your other major antioxidant. So that was a problem. And then had some things that contributed to inflammation. So not long before his heart attack, his doctor had told him, "You're fine. Your cholesterol's good. Your blood sugar's good. His blood pressure was like a little high. It was like 140 something." And so they were talking about, not quite perfect, but not bad. But again, nothing that would have predicted a heart attack. And again, now we were able to at least help him from secondary cardiac risk. And then I had another patient, and she came to me with a family history of her dad having had heart failure and heart disease and diabetes and obesity and lots of things. And again, she had a completely different set of things going on, including a different set of genes that gives her over 4 times the risk of both heart disease and heart failure, but it was more due to inflammation. So again, how do you address that with our typical drugs that are used in Western medicine? There are no drugs that address that inflammatory pathway of the heart. And so again, genomics gives you a lot of insight, and then using that along with the literature, there are natural things that can often address the risk factors that classic medications do not.
Okay. So I'm glad you brought up inflammation because that is one we find ourselves having to educate a lot about because it affects everything. But the other thing is when most people think inflammation, they're thinking about pain, they're thinking about swelling, maybe some bloating, things like that, maybe fever, I feel hot, things like that. But I think the connection between inflammation and heart health is not as well understood. And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go on.
Yeah, and for us as practitioners, I mean, yeah, we'll run HSCRP, we'll run a sedimentation rate. If you really would, if you had a wild hair tail, you might run a IL-6, you're looking at fibrinogen, things like that. So you're getting this big picture of inflammation, but that's not really letting me know if this person has a higher, because they may have literally just had an allergy attack, or they had a workout. So I can't say this is high, you're at a higher risk of heart disease. But what you guys are doing are showing some of these inflammatory pathways that can actually predispose someone to heart health. I know this is a big question. There's a lot of pathways and all these different SNPs to look at. But when it comes to inflammation and heart health, how does IntelliXX DNA help us practitioners identify the risk?
Absolutely. So just taking a step back about the genomics of inflammation, you're absolutely right. Everybody thinks of CRP, and CRP is important. It can reflect vascular inflammation, but there's a lot of kinds of inflammation. So to use the word inflammation is to use the word like sick. So if I were to say to you, Dr. Jones, there's a patient over there in room 2 that has an infection. What would you like to treat them with? You'd be like, can I have a little more information? Is it yeast? Is it a virus? Is it a Lyme disease? Is it a bacterial pneumonia? Is it a UTI? They're all different kinds of infections. Well, inflammation is like that. There are mast cell inflammation. There's vascular inflammation. There's all these different inflammatory receptors, and there's autoimmune type inflammation. So there's more than a dozen different gene variants that are highly related to different diseases like heart disease and brain disease and depression and on and on and on that are inflammatory, but they're different. So with heart disease, the main 2 that have been associated in addition to CRP, and even more so than CRP, is there's one called IL-37. And if you don't have enough of IL-37 to stop inflammation, that's not particularly helpful. And you need to kind of go, what can you do to boost it? But there's another one that is an IL-1, and anything that has number 1 is important. So it's an interleukin-1 receptor. But anyway, don't worry too much about what that means. If you're not genomically educated, but this is supposed to be kind of sense inflammation and turn it off. And if you have it, sometimes that receptor, instead of being attached to the heart, will be floating in the blood. And that makes you not able to turn off cardiac inflammation. So again, that's really important because if you have that receptor floating in the floating form and you don't have enough of these anti-inflammatory um, interleukins as well. There's another one called IL-33. Then that's where you get the 5 times the risk of heart disease. But more importantly, what are you going to do for that? Well, that's where you would do things like curcumin is a good anti-inflammatory that works on has cardiac outcomes. I think that sulforaphane doesn't have quite as many cardiac outcomes, but also works in some of those gene variants. And then if it was somebody who was really sick, where you would also be watching, and if they already had evidence of heart disease, there are some prescription medicines that work on that pathway as well.
Now, this is a good one too, because let's just say you get a genetic report in and it's like, okay, you have IL-1 beta and IL-1R, maybe IL-6. You have these inflammatory genetic variants and they're lit up. And it's like, okay, these are your homozygous, you got the double barrel shotgun. I'm concerned. And I put you on turmeric and maybe quercetin and sulforaphane. And you guys do a great list of listing some of the optimal anti-inflammatories in the report. On the patient side of the house, and if you're just like, hey, doc, I've got these variants, and you're saying take turmeric, because this is genetic, do I need to take this every day the rest of my life based on the genetics?
Well, that's a good question. So I think it depends on what's going on. So for example, you mentioned like quercetin, which really is great for mast cells, which is the allergic type of inflammation. Well, you sometimes, once you get your body healthy, because there's also a lot of foods that you can do to start to increase your general anti-inflammatory, quercetin's from onions and red onions and apples have it. You might only need that at certain times. Like, again, you have your mast cell inflammation when you get exposed to mold, when you get exposed to allergens. So you might be able to use it as needed, some of the different products. IL-6 is huge for both brain and vascular and all kinds of inflammation, but it spikes when you have an infection. So you might go, okay, I've got myself feeling pretty well, but I know that when I get sick, I need to do a little bit of something else. That gene actually is interesting. There's a variant associated with 20 times the risk of depression 6 times the risk of depression for like up to 20 years after you have an infection, if it gets out of control, or after you have a major surgery even. So some people can have triggers. So if you know what your triggers are, then you treat them. If you have problems that are more about kind of ongoing inflammation that relate to the heart, then yeah, you're probably going to be on something like a micronized curcumin, a highly bioavailable form of turmeric your whole life, because you're not going to get younger. And so cardiac risk goes up as you get older. So usually what I do with my patients is I try to find out where they're at and say, okay, if you were only going to do 3 things, here's the top 3 things I would do supplement wise. And then here, diet and lifestyle. If you're willing to do 5 things, this is what I would do. But if I have somebody and they come to me and they're very high risk for cognitive decline or heart disease or any of these chronic illnesses, sometimes some of them will be on 8 or 10 things. And I'll say, I don't, we can talk about you stopping them, but let me tell you what each one is for. And then they don't choose to stop them. So I think it depends on your own individual risk and how much you want to be proactive and preventive. Many people that I see, once I explain to them why I'm making those choices, they're willing to do things long term because they want to protect their brain and their heart and their bones and.
And I always look at some of these things where I explain to patients, I'm like, hey, look, I know you're taking a lot of supplements on your own. I have these recommendations, and now I just did this genetic test with you, and I would need you to take these supplements. And I'll just say, like, look, man, if a tornado is on its way, Wizard of Oz style, and you have to grab some supplements, these are the ones I want you to grab versus the random, what's that? CMOS supplement that you got from CVS, right? These are the ones I need you to take, right? And then they get a better understanding, like, this is your kind of blueprint genetics, and these are the ones I want you to take. Do you take them every day? I get if you miss a day, no, you're not a robot, but these are ones to take with you if you're hopping on the lifeboat.
Exactly. And I think that's a great way to describe it. Some people do come in, and we've had people come in and they'll be on like 20 things. So in that case, we use their genomics to de-prescribe, to say, let's start from blank. from square one and see, what do you really need? What are we trying to do here? Okay, for you, this is something that runs in your family, but this is something based on your genomics that we may want to be proactive about. And so it's really about a conversation. And there's a lot you can do with diet and lifestyle. It just depends on the person, how much work they're willing to put in diet and lifestyle versus whether they want to take supplements, whether they want to do medications. But absolutely, there are some people where I would say for you, for your cardiac, your go-to, you really need that vitamin K2. And then for other people, again, it might be that aspirin, or it might be something that stabilizes their cholesterol and their plaque. It just depends on the person.
Okay. That's it. It's awesome. Now, the next risk factor I want to go through when it comes to heart disease is thrombotic risk or clot risk. And that can be a sneaky one because that one is not tested for, well, the occasional fibrinogen. They'll kind of run that, kind of a clotting cascade, kind of thing with lab work. But in general, I just don't see that being enough for most people, right? And they'll run like, "Hey, I need you to run." Oh God, why am I drawing a big old blank here, man?
Okay.
The early morning podcast. You're doing a surgery. I need you to run this, and you run the test, and it's one. Help me out here. It's
Well, they used to do like PT, PTT, and
That's
now
it.
they're
Yeah,
not doing
no,
that
they
much.
do. They still do. I had a
Yeah,
patient last week. It's the IN. Oh, there we go. INR,
INR.
PTT, early morning podcast, man. And so, but you guys are looking deeper than that. So, what are some of the clotting cascades and pathways that a practitioner can help their patients identify with the tests you guys are doing?
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that we look at is we look at different things. So we look at genes that affect platelets and make you have sticky platelets. But we also look at genes like factor V and factor II, prothrombin, that can affect fibrinogen. And again, if you get a cut on your body, you know that initially you get kind of like an early response. And so you don't you don't keep bleeding. And then you get a late response that kind of fixes it. Well, that's the platelets are the early responders, and then comes in the fibrinogen and some of the other factors. So we look at lots of different things involved in clotting. And the reason that that's important is even though it's only about 4% of the population, for example, that have that prothrombin gene, the factor II, it causes a much higher rate of blood clots when you travel internationally, which many of us do now. It also increases your risk of stroke. It also increases the risk of miscarriages. So in IntelliXX DNA, we have a women's health report, and clotting is really important. But again, taking the topic of miscarriage for younger women, because they care about their health as well, if you're having problems with the sticky platelets, then your doctor would prescribe aspirin for you to help prevent miscarriages. Whereas if you were having problems with these fibrinogen pathways, then you would use low molecular weight heparin. And if you're doing it for stroke risk, you could use lumbrokinase. We don't use that in pregnant women. But so there's lots of different things that you can do, and they're all in the literature. But it's just a good way of highlighting something that can get missed. And I had a patient who his sister had a pulmonary emboli, a blood clot in her lungs, and they still had never tested him. And this was something really important to him. And since we've addressed this in him, his coagulation risk, his cognition's gotten better. Because if you don't get enough blood flow to your brain, that also is important. So clotting is just one small panel of about 10 different little parts of the pathways. There's things IL-6 relates to clotting, and all these different numbers that just have F's in front of them.
Mm,
But I think it's just important to know what's going on for you, and
right.
sometimes it solves people's pain to address their clotting pathways.
Yeah. I think it's just good for people to know, especially especially when they travel a lot as well and things like that. And thankfully, I don't have any smoker patients, and especially if they're smokers, it's like, hey, just let you know these are the risks you're putting yourself under because of these genetics, and it can be eye opening for people.
Absolutely.
Now, another one, and I want to close it out with this because this is kind of like the big one for many people is cholesterol. Because before even going to med school, I've been hearing since I could walk and talk, it's like cholesterol is bad for your heart. And then that's changed with dietary. Just in my short time on Earth, it's actually not short anymore, 50s. But that's changed a lot too on the recommendations and what's a good cholesterol versus a bad cholesterol. Oh wait, LDL is not really a bad cholesterol, and HDL is not always a good cholesterol, and it gets confusing. But when it comes to the genomics, there are some markers that can show what a person's kind of predisposition is to high cholesterol. But sometimes, like I said in the beginning, they'll have these markers and they have like perfect cholesterol. So, how can we use this report to either identify the risk or even make some dietary changes for people, even if their cholesterol looks low when they have the variants?
Well, I think that the point that you brought up is genomics is one piece of the puzzle. So one of the main genes that can relate to how much HDL you have versus LDL is it's called CETP. And you can look at genomic variants, but remember that diet is a huge part of that. So it's just like the obesity pathways. You can have genes that increase the risk of obesity, but a lot of them do their magic mystery or their magic badness through saturated fat. And so if you're eating less, if you know that about yourself and you eat less saturated fat and more plant fats, then you may not have struggles with obesity. There's a lot of different ways that diet and genomics interact. So there absolutely are genes that relate to cholesterol, that relate to, again, not just your body's ability to synthesize cholesterol, but also even break it down. But to be honest, remember, knowing just your cholesterol is not enough because there are also so many other factors. And there's a U-shaped curve, like having too low of cholesterol is not necessarily good for you, and too high, unless you have heart disease, then sometimes the cardiologist will make your cholesterol go artificially low. But if your main risk factors, and IntelliXX DNA does a lot of brain health, and if your main risk factors have to do with neurodegenerative diseases, like for example, like relating to things like Parkinson's, too low of cholesterol is not necessarily good either. So I think that which kind of brings to just so people know, when you do IntelliXX DNA, there's not one report for heart and one report for diabetes and one report for this. Like our executive report, which is the most common one that people in your practice do, it's going to do your brain and your hormones and your, blood sugar and your weight and things that have to do with clotting and heart disease and your eyes and your bones because um, people, you don't know what they really need to address unless you look at a broader picture. So if you're talking about longevity, there are absolutely genes that relate to longevity. Interestingly, we'll have to do that another time, but a lot of them relate to oxidative stress. But you need to know about a lot of different disease states. And you and I both are people who look at the root cause. You also need to understand your inflammation, your oxidative stress, what nutrients you transport into your brain. Do you build up calcium in your heart, et cetera? So I think that cholesterol to me is so much less important now than it was when I was first trained as a doctor 30 years ago, because it's just one tiny marker that got on the radar because high cholesterol is a common cause of heart disease. But I also don't want to miss the less common causes that I can't see on someone's blood work.
Okay. So it's early in the morning here in Arizona, and I'm starting my day off like most people with a cup of coffee. But one of the more fascinating variants in the report shows that some people are just these slow metabolizers of caffeine. I believe it's the CYP1A2. And I see the report, and thank God I didn't have that one because it says like, hey, even drinking 2 or 3 cups of coffee a day can significantly increase the risk of a heart attack. I was like, okay, this is a big one because how many people are drinking 2 to 5 cups a day and not knowing they're putting themselves at this risk of heart disease? So with that, like, how I wish I could say like why are more doctors not doing this? But is this one to really be mindful of? Because I know when you get that report and you tell someone as a coffee drinker, like, hey, dude, like you got to cut this down to less than one a day or stop drinking coffee, they're not going to be very happy. So how do you have that discussion?
Well, I think that what they probably, if they have that particular gene variant, the reason they're more susceptible to heart disease from coffee is they're slower at metabolizing the caffeine. And so I think that what's happened is they've gotten kind of this addiction cycle going on to it where they've done it and built up tolerance and done more and more and more. And usually you can help them reset. And usually the funny thing is, they're also, because they're slow metabolizers of caffeine, the people who are doing that, they're like, well, I'm too tired. That's why I'm drinking so much. Well, that's because the caffeine for them is lasting so long that it's affecting their sleep. And so that they're not really, like, maybe they fall asleep because they're really tired. But if the caffeine is lasting 18 hours instead of 3 or 4, they're going to get shorter sleep, and they're going to wake up in the middle of the night and not be able to sleep well and get back to sleep. And so then they can only sleep a half a night. So I work with them. I say, let's just try this. Let's try getting you off of caffeine. We'll do it slowly. And let's get your sleep feeling better so you don't need as much caffeine. But I think that, again, most people, they want to understand themselves. They don't come looking for a doctor like you or me or the doctors that are using IntelliXX DNA unless they want to understand it. And I work with people where they're at. That doesn't, if you have somebody who's 30, luckily they're not at super high risk for heart disease in their 30s or 40s. So there may be other things I want to work on first, and then we'll work on weaning down their caffeine. But I think it's a conversation between you and your patients, which gene variants we address first. And part of it, again, depends on what stage of life you're in. I mean, it's really, it's important to know if you're at risk for osteoporosis and keep your bones healthy when you're young. But if you're having depression or anxiety, you may feel more concerned about, let's get my depression and my mental health under control and then circle back to my bones. Because again, we didn't talk about mental health today, but that's another one where there's a lot of hidden causes and people are being labeled, oh, you're anxious or you're depressed, when it's something that can be addressed and reversed.
That's amazing to hear. So I want to close out this part here. Again, I think I said that, but it's like I have so many questions. And like I said, we can literally make this like a 4-hour podcast. I'm trying my best to control myself here. So one of the things I really like to talk about in my lectures and presentations is homocysteine, because it's one of those risk factors that I don't think gets enough attention. And just super high level for the listeners who are not familiar, homocysteine is a sulfur-containing amino acid our body uses primarily. It's going to kind of has two fates, right? It's either going to go get remethylated to methionine that helps with a lot of neurological processes, DNA repair, or it goes through another process called transsulfuration, eventually leading to glutathione, one of our favorite compounds you mentioned earlier. But if it gets too high, it's no longer fun, right? Now it can actually cause, stiffening of the blood vessels, be a clot risk, plaque risk, all these things. Now I'm going somewhere with this, Sharon, is because when I first started learning about it, I was like, okay, I just got to run an MTHFR and that's going to solve everything. This is it. MTHFR, run this, put you on some methylated folates, methylated B12. And then I started doing you guys' report. I'm like, oh man, I have just only looked at 10% of this puzzle when it comes to this. And I think it's fascinating that you guys do this. So for the practitioners and even some of the patients and kind of people interested listening, how can this IntelliXX report give a better assessment of elevated homocysteine and the risk factors than just running an MTHFR?
Yeah, that's a good question. The thing about homocysteine, if your homocysteine's high, it means something's backed up somewhere. So understanding what's backed up is important because you might be like, okay, so what does it matter? Why can't we just, isn't there something we can do just to specifically treat homocysteine? And there are a lot of the pathways that relate to homocysteine relate to the methyl B vitamins. And so you can do that to bring the homocysteine down. But if the problem is that the reason the homocysteine is high is because of that transsulfuration pathway being stuck, well, then you're not going to make enough cysteine, because the purpose of that homocysteine CBS pathway is to free up cysteine so you can make glutathione. And you need to know that, because then you need to get enough cysteine. And cysteine's hard to get from the diet. So sometimes we'll give people N-acetylcysteine. That's what they give in the ER, in fact, for Tylenol overdose and for certain liver issues. But then you would give them something like NAC for cysteine so they can make enough glutathione. If somebody's problem with their homocysteine was coming from MTRR, not addressing that can give you 3 times the risk of ADHD. And so you would want to know what you have to address and where. And then there are certain people in the homocysteine pathway that they can't. So there's MTHFR, which is making your folate into methylfolate. But there is also people who don't have an adequate receptor to let methylfolate enter the blood. So they then need an alternative kind of folate that can kind of just pass across more easily using this other receptor, and they'd benefit from folinic acid. So the homocysteine cycle is important. And the reason MTHFR became so popular is 2 copies of that gene's about 14%, 1 copy's in about 45%. So way back when, 2010, 2013, that was one of the genes that people would look at doing a different technology of PCR when we had to do each gene individually. And so it was one of the first genes that was well studied because it is so common and it's important. But what if you have the gene that makes it so that you can't make the cofactor for all these brain chemicals that are in the homocysteine cycle? It's called tetrahydrobiopterin. That's only 4% of the population. Well, for you, just giving methylfolate's not going to be enough. You're going to want to push that, tetrahydrobiopterin. Again, these are all big words. So I think the bird's eye view is we need to understand what pieces of that cycle, just like we talked about pieces of the puzzle, are important for each individual so we can know how to best address them. And for the majority, if you didn't have genomics, just take a methyl B complex with methylfolate and B12 and B6 and maybe some folinic acid, and that's going to help a lot of the time. But again, there still even are some people where it's that cysteine that they need, or it's the BH4. And those are the people who sometimes they're having mental health concerns, or they're having cognitive problems, or they don't feel well, are people who have some of the less common gene variants. But again, we all have some gene variants that are less common. So understanding which ones they are allows us to kind of best care and feed our own bodies.
Okay. Speaking of, I love your segue. Speaking of caring and feeding for our bodies, let's talk about obesity and metabolism and longevity. Because if people don't know by now, obesity and type 2 diabetes, they have an interconnection with heart disease. They increase the risk. But you guys run some really cool genetic variants rather, from in the STAT gene, the ENPP, FTO gene, which really can show like, hey, you've got this genetic propensity towards obesity or reduction. Your appetite can't be controlled, or how you even process fats. So when you see these things with people, how do you find in your practice, do people say, oh, I've got these variants, I really need to make some changes here? Or do you find any resistance with that? Because they may have like a normal A1C and they're like, yeah, thanks, doc, but I look good here.
I think it's a yes and a yes. So I have patients who they see things and they want to make changes, and people who are a little bit more resistant, because one of the things, it's kind of a love-hate relationship that people have with the genes that relate to our metabolic health, blood sugar and obesity, because so many of them can be addressed with diet and lifestyle. And that is the hardest thing to write a prescription for. And even within the pathway, not all of them are eat less, because that would, again, you don't need genomics to say, gosh, if you're overweight, you could eat less. That's not specific enough, and that's not going to help everyone. So one of the first people we did back in 2016, that she was struggling with her weight, and she was only, she wasn't hugely overweight. She was in the mid 160s. She was about 5'4". So she was overweight, but not morbidly obese. Well, she found out that she had all of the STAT3 genes, when those make you much more sensitive to saturated fat, which is found in anything that's like a mammal. So beef and pork and, all the fat from any, lamb, and to a lesser extent, chicken and things like that. But she went, just dramatically changed her diet, not to restrict the quantity of food, because that made her feel, if she's restricted quantity of food, then she was felt like she was dieting, but just changed what she ate to mostly being plant-based with more fish, a little bit of chicken. And the weight just came off, and she went from a size 12 to a size 6. And now, even over 10 years later, she's still staying between a 6 and an 8. So she's staying at that kind of 130s to low 140 weight, which again is hugely different for a woman and their health. And so some women will be motivated. I've had other people that are like, well, give me the medications. And I think that long as you have a conversation, even if they do use some medications, we're now in the era of GLP-1, so people want the easy way to lose weight. But I still think I have had good success with getting people to understand the relationship between what they eat and their genomics. There's a gene that makes people unable to tell when they're full. Well, with that gene, sometimes just saying, okay, you just make a rule for yourself that you can't make do a full plate, but limit the number of times a day that you eat snacks or that you eat food. And so different people can address it different ways. And then some of those genes are very important. So you mentioned ENPP1. That actually would be one of my top 10 genes that people should know that very few genomic reports to have, because 2 copies of it can give you 6 times the risk of diabetes. But a lot of the risk factors for diabetes, people think of associated with obesity, but with TCF7L2, again, that's a skinny diabetic gene, and ENPP1, you don't have to have people that have high insulin and are heavy. There's other reasons that they're at high risk for it. And so that ENPP1 is like a channel that doesn't open to let insulin into the cells. So you can have normal and let blood sugar into the cells. So you can have kind of a normal insulin level, but the door isn't being opened to let the sugar out of the blood into your cells. And that causes a lot of problems. So that gene you can address with metformin if you want a prescription and it dramatically changes it, or you can give them something like berberine. So there's real specific things you can use for each gene. But for the other one, like TCF7L2, whey protein, akkermansia, that's where the GLP-1s work. So there's lots of different things you can do with specificity, whether it's from brain science or metabolic.
That's good to know. And I frame the conversation, especially with people in there, they're really fit and they're really healthy. Like, hey, this is great. I'm like, oh, this is good. And this is the other analogy I look, it's like, hey, you know what? When I give you this report, I want to think of this as like your genetic cookbook. This is the recipe that you were given, right? But because you're working out, maybe you change that recipe a little bit. You're adding a little bit of salt, a little bit of paprika to it, right? Things like this. And now the recipe may be better, or maybe it's not as bitter of a taste as it would have been. I'm so ridiculous with analogies. I think people get tired of me with this, but I think just to understand it, you have a chance to make a change. And I think that's where I love when someone can come in, you got these variants, but look at and I always have their blood work right there. It's like, here's a variant, but here's where you are. So I can see if you're turning these genes on or you're doing a great job of keeping them inactive. And so I think and we'll get into the question of how to overcome some of the anxiety about the reports. But I think that it's big being able to show that it's like, you have this, but look at your lab work. You're doing great. Let's keep doing this and do some things to prevent it.
Absolutely. A lot of times people have already figured out some of what's in the report. They're like, there's a gene that makes people not tolerate leftovers well because as meats and leftover meat, like old, Chinese food or chicken or fish that's like not maybe was sitting out in the kitchen counter too long or at the fish counter. And those people, again, because it has to do with how proteins act when they get old, they tend to go, oh, I hate leftovers. They've already figured that out, or I don't like fermented foods. So sometimes people figure certain things out about themselves. But again, when people, you had mentioned anxiety over the report, usually when people have anxiety over genomic testing, they think it's going to contribute to something bad. And that's not what IntelliXX DNA is about. IntelliXX DNA is about empowering someone to understand the components that they could address to improve their health. None of the diseases, none of the gene variants in IntelliXX DNA are pathogenic or disease causing. They're all small pieces of the puzzle that we don't put in the report till our research team has figured out, based on the literature, how could you address this with diet, lifestyle, supplements, and medicines? So it's more of an empowering report. And you're not going to go home with 30 different things because it's a conversation between you and your clinician about, okay, let's talk about what your priorities are, and then how do we address them? So it's exact opposite. It's like, gosh, if you were just trying to address everything based on symptoms, there's too many choices. You're having pain? Let's talk about what could be contributing to your pain. Here are the 3 things I want you to do. Did that get rid of your pain? Great. Now let's talk about let's talk about working on your weight, or let's talk about some of the things relating to your heart. So it's more about taking the patient's priorities and being able to understand them and address them with specificity, even when maybe other things haven't worked for them, or being proactive in your prevention for longevity and health.
That's awesome to hear. It's awesome because you can make the changes, make the impact. Uh, I know because we got on here, I was like, man, there's so many topics we can go over, but I know we were really trying to focus on some of the cardiovascular things. But I want to circle back on one because this is one of the more fascinating variants I found in the report, and I actually had it in my report, which was the TOM 40 or TOMM 40. And the image that I see from the report is it kind of makes me think of like the mitochondrial pores getting clogged with amyloid. And I was like, wait a minute here. We're taught that amyloid plaque in the brain, this is one of the Alzheimer's things to look out for, or that they find in the biopsies after the fact. And I'm like, wait a minute. And I was trying to put the connection together, like amyloid, mitochondria, inside of my cells, because I usually think of amyloid plaques as outside of the cells, is where I'm going with that. So, is that something to be mindful of for cognitive function, mitochondrial function, Alzheimer's risk, or a little bit of all three?
I think a little bit of all three. So, when we think of any of those different things that cause plaques in our brains, when you think of tau, when you think of amyloid, they all start out intracellularly. And then when the neurons get damaged, they become extracellular, and then they form the clumping and the tangles, and it's just kind of like, more of the mess that, but they all start out in our cells. And mitochondria, though, you can have amyloid in the cells, but the thing that I think about with mitochondria with the TOM 40 is we need to, it's kind of like Hawaii. You know how everything has to be brought to Hawaii because you can't, there's just not a lot being manufactured there. So you have to bring all the raw materials to Hawaii, and the toilet paper, and, it gets shipped in, and lots of things are shipped to the island country. Well, mitochondria are like little islands in our cells, and they're amazing. They're powerhouses. They ultimately turn oxygen into energy, and they're very, very important. They're our backup energy source for our brain, for our heart, for everything. But there are certain things they need brought in order to do their job, to run their little factory. And if you have clogging of the TOM 40 because you have a change in your TOM 40, you have to be extra careful to protect the mitochondria, because that mitochondria can get more damaged because of the problems with it. And when you damage the mitochondria, then they don't work as well, and then you have then you're less able to get rid of oxidative stress and other things. So what I tell my mitochondrial patients that have TOM 40 to do is we just need to take care of those mitochondrial membranes, because your body, if you have two mitochondria with damaged parts, so you can have, this one over here with a little damage, this one over here with the damage, they'll come together with fission and fusion and repair. And that work with this Dr. Garth Nicholson, who got nominated for a Nobel Prize. And he worked at MD Anderson, where there was a lot of cancer research going on because it's a cancer hospital, and chemotherapy damages the mitochondria as well. So what I tell my TOM 40 people is, really, as you get older, because we lose mitochondria as we get older, you may need some extra mitochondrial membrane support. So there are a number of products that have the amino acids, the fatty acids, all kinds of things that the mitochondria need, phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine, all those things together in one capsule or one package to help you repair your mitochondria. So it's more for me about, it's not about the amyloid causing the damage so much as not letting, if the pores get blocked, you can't get the shipping lanes open to get the stuff into the mitochondria that the mitochondria need to do their job. So keep your mitochondria healthy. You just need a little more mitochondrial support, including membrane support.
Perfect. And that's going to be one of the cool ones. We were talking on a previous call about looking at certain peptides and other longevity kind of interventions. And this is going to be a big one, not just for me personally, but there are some peptides. I wish I could share it now, but we're going to wait, that I believe can be really beneficial for this particular variant. So I'm looking forward to those conversations.
And I think that's a great place to end, Greg, is that's where you and I are together going this year. IntelliXX DNA has classically focused on diet, lifestyle, supplements, and medications. But we're looking into the research for our clinicians that do use peptides to help them better understand where do these different peptides work. Again, with that same evidence-based approach of saying just giving our clinicians the evidence so they can understand on a precision medicine level based on someone's genomics how peptides work with more specificity.
That's it. Heard it here first. 2026, IntelliXX and peptides coming together. Peanut butter and jelly.
Yes.
Man, peanut butter and jelly is ham and cheese, whatever your
And
favorites are, bacon, lettuce, tomato. We're talking, I'm literally naming the worst things to eat. But the fact that this is coming soon is exciting. So I'm looking forward to helping you guys, if I can, along with that project.
yes, I'm looking forward to working with you on that. And so there's going to be, reach out if you guys, if you are a patient wanting to learn more about IntelliXX DNA, if you're a patient of Dr. Jones, he will be happy to tell you more. If you're a patient listening from another state, where he is not, and I don't know if you're across all states, if they still reach out to you, or they can go to our website to look for clinicians. And if they're fellow physicians, and you want to get trained on IntelliXX DNA and learn more, and you can learn where Greg will be speaking on some of these topics at Longevity Fest. At Calm, not Longevity Fest, at Calm, which is a wonderful conference coming up in February. And
Okay, good. So I want to make sure I'm going to put this in the show notes too, but I want to make sure that you can let people know where is the best place to find, or is there a particular website to go to learn more about the IntelliXX DNA or even some of the work that you guys are doing?
Yes, for both clinicians and patients, you can go to IntelliXX DNA, and IntelliXX DNA comes from the word intelligent, INTELL, and then two X's because Carol and I are the co-founders and we're both women, and then DNA. So it's IntelliXXDNA.com. And there's both a patient and a physician, clinician facing page. If you're a patient, you can find someone who is a licensed healthcare provider that has a license in your state. And if you're a physician and want to get trained, we would be happy to get you trained. We offer free training and free mentoring, and have a great group of users and a live conference every year and some virtual ones as well. So,
And I would tell the practitioners listening that it was really intimidating at first. It was like learning a new language. And like if you take up a new language, it can get a little frustrating in the beginning. Like, this is really fast. I don't know what they're saying. What are you talking about? The CETP. And with repetition, it comes because even as Sharon was talking, I was like, oh, I know that one. I know that one. I use that one. And, you get better. So it's being patient with the process. And I also want to let those doctors know and practitioners know that you guys actually do offer consultations with the report. So you can go over with one of your staff to kind of break it
yes,
down,
we,
which is
we
really
actually
helpful.
we actually strongly encourage. It's free. Go through the first 3 reports with us is what we offer, and we really encourage it. We can help you. And coming also this year, you're going to see some changes in IntelliXX DNA that make it even easier to use and easier to interpret. But we've already added a hotspot a year or 2 back, but we are making some more changes that are going to make it a lot easier for you, so you can feel like you can use the genomics and learn as you go along in a much more user-friendly way. So
Yeah.
watch for
Thank
those
you.
changes coming this year.
Looking forward to it. Well, I want to say thank you for making time for this. I'm really excited that you were able to swing by virtually for the podcast. It's, like I said, it's been a long time coming, and I'm grateful for your time and expertise.
Thank you for having me. We'll see you in February when we're at
I'll
the
see you
same
there.
conference together live.
Yeah, yes, we will be. All right, everyone. It's been another episode of the Dr. Greg Jones Optimization Academy. There will be notes for Dr. Sharon in the show notes on those websites and finding out more about her. And I'll put the registration link for Calm in there too for the practitioners who want to come to that and learn more. And until next time, everyone, thanks for listening as always, and I'll see you next time.